Greetings, everyone. Here are the main points in today's video. Lechon 2. Why is the Made in Canada armored vehicle line, converted from commercial truck chassis and having experienced the heat of battle in Ukraine, considered the perfect survival choice for a small army like Moldova? Breaking the three iron chains of the one-way bridge, the tense journey of the Chisinau government as they successively neutralize critical levers from energy blackmail, constitutional neutrality, to the geographical predicament of 1,500 Russian soldiers in the separatist region of Transnistria. Merging history with the dramatic spy intrigue over the secretly passed national unification bill between Romania and Moldova. Is this a step towards self-reliance or a calculated conspiracy orchestrated behind the scenes to sabotage the westward path? From a critical perspective, let's analyze the core limitations of Moldova, as the new energy system is still too unstable and the constitutional barrier remains a major obstacle against brutal attacks. Welcome to Luan Ban Chin Su's analysis program. Before we get into the content, please take a few seconds to like the video and subscribe to the channel so we can continue. Thank you, dear audience. Ladies and gentlemen, since the dawn of independence after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Moldova has always been surrounded by poverty, military weakness, and outdated weaponry, making this country one of the most vulnerable points on the map of Europe. This prolonged exhaustion has turned the small country into a fragile and powerless entity in the face of the specter of war flaring up in its neighboring country, Ukraine. However, the real stranglehold that the Kremlin imposes on Moldova does not only lie in outdated weaponry, but is also operated through three sophisticated strategic levers that are suffocating the country. First is Transnistria, a breakaway region along the eastern bank of the Dniester River, now entirely outside the Chisinau government's control. About 1,500 Russian soldiers are firmly stationed here, a force that the Kremlin euphemistically calls peacekeepers. But for Moldova, it is considered an illegal occupation. This frozen conflict acts as a powerful lever, holding Moldova's sovereignty and territorial integrity hostage, blocking any efforts at Western integration. The second trap is energy dependence. As most of Moldova's electricity for decades has relied entirely on a power plant located right in Transnistria, operating on cheap gas supplied by Russia, an invisible weapon that Moscow can tighten at any time to punish Chisinau's determination. And the final trap is the state of neutrality enshrined in the Constitution, a legal snare that keeps Moldova outside defensive alliances like NATO, leaving them isolated and completely unprotected against the turmoil of the times. When the flames of war broke out fully in 2022 with Russia's attack on Ukraine, all these vulnerabilities suddenly turned into an imminent threat. In the early days of the war, a military map displayed by a close ally of Russia outlined an ambitious offensive stretching from Odessa straight to Transnistria. In other words, in Moscow's strategic playbook, Moldova was theoretically the next target of expansionist ambitions. Facing the suffocating encirclement and the risk of being swallowed whole, the government in Chisinau quietly but firmly carried out a historic pivot to save its own fate. And then came a bold move that Putin would certainly never be satisfied with. For a long time, the Kremlin's leader has always considered the small nation as his own inviolable backyard, guaranteed by the presence of Russian troops in Transnistria, by its policy of neutrality, its constitution, and decades-long energy dependence. Moldova is taking slow but steady steps toward the Western world. On June 30, the Moldovan Ministry of Defense and the Estonian Defense Investment Center officially signed a framework agreement to purchase more than 100 Senator armored vehicles for the Moldovan National Armed Forces. For a small country, the scale of this deal is enormous, with the contract value exceeding $57 million. However, the key turning point lies in the origin of this funding. The entire massive procurement deal mentioned above did not use a single cent from Moldova's limited defense budget, but was fully funded as a non-refundable grant through a special mechanism called the European Peace Facility of the European Union. This is considered by military analysts to be one of the largest single military capability enhancements that Moldova has received since its declaration of independence. The structure of this agreement is also an astonishing phenomenon. The procurement process was not managed unilaterally by Moldova itself, but was sponsored and overseen by Estonia, a veteran member of both the European Union and NATO. These military assets are being urgently manufactured at defense industry factories in Canada, and the entire handover process is expected to be completed before May 2027. This means that Moldova is acting under Europe's solid institutional umbrella, freeing them from the burden of having to handle a complex military procurement process on their own. As early as 2025, also funded by the European Union, the first two Senator armored vehicles from the same manufacturer were delivered to the Moldovan police force. That was essentially a rehearsal, a field test for the large-scale military procurement campaign that had just been approved. Defense cooperation between Moldova and Europe does not stop at a simple purchase contract, but is a relationship that is being systematically and strategically strengthened and is growing steadily deeper. The addition of more than 100 modern armored vehicles to the arsenal is a fundamental change in the soldiers' right to live and fight. From training activities, border patrols, and escorting equipment to rapid response to crises, the presence of these vehicles has completely redefined tactical mobility. This leap forward provides an unmatched mobile and flexible shield, especially in the fiery border region of Transnistria. The choice of the Senator vehicle line perfectly matches the reality of a country without an independent defense industry to maintain a complex armored fleet, affordable yet by no means weak. This machine carries up to 12 soldiers and crew under bulletproof armor that resists conventional infantry weapons. In particular, the MRR MZAP anti-mine and ambush version, which embodies hard-earned lessons from the battlefield in Ukraine, features a double V-shaped hull design, blast-resistant seats, and enhanced suspension. It is thoroughly optimized to protect human lives against improvised mines and explosive devices, meeting NATO's strict standards. This is an optimal personnel transport vehicle, economically efficient and absolutely safe. Senator has become a leading Western armored vehicle symbol, often seen in Ukraine's defense against the Russian army. By the end of 2025, more than 2,000 Senator vehicles had been delivered to Ukrainian forces, directly experiencing the harshest and most brutal conditions on the front lines. Rushing into the center of the battlefield always brings tragic losses. The independent monitoring project ORIS has recorded more than 100 Senator vehicles destroyed or damaged on the battlefield. Owning vehicles standardized according to the European system means that the Moldovan military is gradually synchronizing its combat capabilities, technical procedures, and coordination ability with NATO and EU member states. This is the perfect stepping stone for joint exercises, standardizing combat procedures, and paving the way for a deeper security partnership in the future. The remnants of Soviet-era armored vehicles are being swept away to make room for modern vehicles made in Canada, purchased with euros from Brussels, which vividly reflects the historic shift of a nation. This has pushed the Kremlin into a state of deep concern, because until now, Moscow's entire strategy toward Moldova has been based on the ultimate goal of keeping this country weak, divided, and forced to remain neutral. A more resilient, more confident Moldova, integrated into the Western defense structure, is a nightmare for Russia's ambitions to maintain its sphere of influence. Even though 100 armored vehicles cannot yet create a direct military threat that would change the balance of power, the path it sets out is what makes Moscow unable to sit still. Moldova is seeking security by breaking away from Russia's influence and turning completely toward the Western world. The most sensitive and potentially explosive part of this gamble remains the breakaway region of Transnistria. It must be objectively acknowledged that the Senator vehicle is not a heavy offensive weapon used to launch a campaign of reconquest, but rather a defensive shield and a means to enhance tactical mobility. However, when the overall deterrence capability of the Chisinau government is enhanced, it will indirectly upend the equation in Transnistria. Russia has long justified its military presence here on the sole pretext of protecting the breakaway region and the ethnic Russian community. But as Moldova becomes increasingly stable and closely aligned with the West, that protection rhetoric suddenly becomes hollow and loses its legitimacy. What's more, about 1,500 Russian soldiers stationed in Transnistria are now trapped in a very dire geographical predicament. They are completely isolated, with Moldovan territory on one side and Ukraine, which is engulfed in the flames of war, on the other. Without a direct land border with Russia, Reinforcing troops or resupplying equipment from Moscow is almost an impossible task. Each move to strengthen Mosovar, it puts this isolated Russian outpost in an even tougher defensive spot. Given that situation, the possibility of Russia launching a direct military intervention is extremely low. Because the quagmire of war in Ukraine has already consumed all of Moscow's strategic resources, not to mention they have no way to access Transnistria geographically. For many years, Mosovar has always been a prime testing ground for Russia's disinformation campaigns, covert funding of opposition forces, and political manipulation. Moscow's goal is not to send in invading troops, but to undermine stability from within, set up a puppet government, and steer Mosovar away from the path of Western integration. In recent years, the government has systematically neutralized each of Moscow's strategic cards, with the most compelling evidence being the battle on the energy front. At the beginning of 2025, the Kremlin launched a cunning move by unilaterally cutting off gas supplies to the Transnistria region, a sinister plot aimed at plunging the entire country of Mosovar into a devastating energy crisis in the freezing winter, forcing the nation to its knees. However, Moscow's calculations completely failed in the face of the swift intervention of the European Union through an emergency aid package. This was smoothly coordinated with Mosovar's quick shift to seeking alternative energy sources from Romania. This small country even activated a strategic high-voltage line called the Independence Line, allowing electricity to be transmitted directly from Romania without having to be controlled by or dependent on the breakaway region of Transnistria. Mosovar, a country that once had to rely on electricity generated from Russian gas, has now broken those chains with its own hands, turning Moscow's energy card into a bitter blowback. Russia intervened in Mosovar's 2024 and 2025 elections on an unprecedented scale, using every tactic from manipulating votes, cyber attacks, creating massive fake news networks, to pumping in hundreds of millions of euros in illegal funding. An investigative report exposed a shocking truth in just a single month. Over $15 million were smuggled through Russian banks into the accounts of more than 130,000 Mosovar citizens. But despite the barrage of smears and dirty money, President Maia Sandu's pro-European party still boldly claimed victory, firmly steering the Mosovar ship on its chosen course, turning the country into a model symbol of resilience against Russia's hybrid warfare campaigns. That destiny of diplomatic and cultural separation was concretized by a symbolic decision on July 4th, when the Mosovar government ordered the complete closure of the Russian Science and Culture Center in the capital, one of the Kremlin's most powerful soft power weapons here. Although the separatist Transnistrian authorities immediately tried to retaliate by opening their own Russian center in Tiraspol, the Chisinau government firmly rejected and condemned it in the strongest terms. Mosovar officials issued a chilling warning that this illegal initiative is not simply a political provocation, but very likely a dangerous trap disguised as education and entertainment, aiming to lure and recruit young people and then send them straight into the meat grinder on the Ukrainian front. Now, this great secession is entering a life-or-death chapter in history, with the ultimate goal of making Mosovar an official member of the European Union before 2030. On that path, accession negotiations that had been frozen for many years due to Hungary's veto have finally been reopened. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, a more fundamental and radical scenario is being considered: reunification with Romania. This idea of a great unification suddenly flared up on many agendas on June 24, 2026, when the Romanian House of Representatives passed a bill aimed at unification with Mosovar. However, the truth behind this agenda is actually a thrilling and calculated drama. In reality, this bill was not a triumphant anthem for those who desired unification, but was actually proposed by SOS Romania, a far-right, pro-Russian party. President Maia Sandu immediately reacted strongly, exposing this as a clumsy play orchestrated by Moscow's agents to smear and undermine the sacred idea of unification. In other words, Russia is deliberately using a fake show of support to sabotage this process from within. However, the Mosovar army is still a very small entity. More than 100 armored vehicles, while a significant reinforcement for a force of only 6,000 people, is still not enough to turn this country into a military power capable of changing the course of events. More importantly, this deal is completely powerless in addressing Moscovar's most pressing vulnerability, the Transnistria problem. The guns of Russian soldiers and the separatist apparatus in this region have been entrenched here for more than 30 years, and resolving this deadlock is much more difficult than people think because of the solid constitutional barrier. According to Moscovar's constitution, any decision that changes national sovereignty, such as unification with Romania, requires the consent of the vast majority of all registered voters, not just those who actually cast their ballots. Russia has never given up, as it continues to pour hundreds of millions of euros to manipulate elections and maintain its fake news tentacles. Moscovar's achievements are real, but nothing is irreversible. For decades, Vladimir Putin's Russia has used three iron chains to bind Moscovar to its orbit: the bayonets of soldiers in Transnistria, energy blackmail, and the neutrality clause in the Constitution. But today, all three of those chains are loosening and breaking apart piece by piece. The armored vehicles purchased with European capital, proudly entering the ranks of the Moscovar army, are the living, breathing symbol of this great breakaway. Could this be the beginning of the irreversible collapse of Russia's sphere of influence in the region?